Today's sacred story comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 13 through 22. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple with the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. I hope that most of us have heard today's scripture passage. I think it's a great example of Jesus' ministry, one of resistance, defiance, and making good trouble. Now, for those of us who haven't steeped ourselves in the context of first century Palestine before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was, and is for many today, considered the most holy place in Judaism. It is said that God demanded the Jewish people build the temple and promised God would dwell within it, in the Holy of Holies. Or that God would dwell with some of humanity's fanciest priests, as the case may have been, because most people, even most clergy, weren't allowed into the Holy of Holies. Jewish people from around the region would make pilgrimages to the temple, and a big part of Jewish practice at the time surrounded temple rituals, most of which involved sacrifice. So, if you were making a long journey on foot, you might not want to bring your sacrificial doves or goats with you, right? Kind of cramps the vibe of that journey. So people would buy animals for their sacrifices at the temple, which meant that there was an industry of currency conversion, right? Because people are coming from all different places. This whole economy is built around the temple, and one could imagine that it and those regulating it might become corrupt. Jesus goes in and whips people, like the animals they are selling, and he flips over tables of those profiting from this industry, like he's on an episode of The Housewives. As we read this ancient story, we ask, what does this have to teach us about our lives today? Maybe we can draw parallels with modern reality TV, but I doubt that our authors had anything like that in mind. The Gospel of John is also the least literal of the 4 Gospels. So where is the analogy, the metaphor? I presume this doesn't mean we go turn up the animal sacrifice purchase booths at our local church, because things like that don't exist anymore. What does it mean? What is the essence of what Jesus is after here? Jesus is challenging leadership. He is a spiritual leader showing up to the house of the biggest spiritual leaders around and calling them out. Kind of like protesters camping outside of Netanyahu's house. He's got criticism about the way the money is moving and about the way the people are being treated. If you were a Jewish person during this period and you were told you need to perform a temple ritual, that's not really an ask. One considered ritually unclean was ostracized from their community, unable to participate fully until they are made ritually clean. Making a sacrifice wasn't really optional, so neither was buying that goat. You can see how this is starting to look like the system of indulgences that Martin Luther was all upset about back in the day. There was a whole system of it here. None of it on its own looks too suspicious. I mean, people back then weren't literate, so they couldn't very well argue with what religious leaders told them scripture and tradition said. People used different currency, so there was going to be money changers in the area. And if you needed to sacrifice an animal or grain or something, you had to come about that animal or grain somehow. But altogether, the system was rigged against the most common of us, those who were just trying to get right with their community and their God. They were just trying to follow the rules, which apparently required a big trip to the temple and purchasing a sacrifice. Now, I think that in today's world, things can seem much the same. Whether we're the money changer or the person purchasing a sacrifice, most of us feel like we're not doing anything wrong. We're just doing our job. We're just trying to get by in this system that we didn't invent. And that's the problem. The system is here whether we are part of putting it there or not, whether we are profiting from it currently or not. And we have to decide whether or not to keep the whole thing going, because we don't know a different way. In fact, some of the other ways we have seen other people, other nations doing things have turned out pretty badly, right? So maybe we should just keep sitting at these tables and keep changing money. But Jesus says, destroy the temple. Now, Jesus was pretty radical, but I don't know how seriously he would have suggested we raise city blocks, which the temple in Jerusalem essentially is, if not larger. It's a giant complex at a time when skyscrapers and multi-room dwellings aren't really a thing. If he's not talking about acts of terrorism, what is he talking about? Now, the author of this gospel is writing at a time fairly removed from this moment, when the theology surrounding Jesus is pretty developed. They are here suggesting that Jesus is proclaiming that the body is the temple. We hear Paul and other authors use language like this. Jesus doesn't mean literally destroy the temple, but I think he does mean to destroy the idea of it. Much of his ministry is about getting away from the ritual and law that can amount to the perfect being the enemy of the good. Jesus wants us to understand that the most important and central place that God dwells is within us. It isn't in a building, and God's love for us does not change because we burned some wheat in a special way. Maybe God is honored by that, and maybe God enjoys such expressions of love, sure. But any parent knows that if a child brings you a flower or a drawing, it's lovely, but it's not why you love them. Had they not made that offering, your love would be the same. God delights in love, however it is expressed. If the temple is within us, though, How we are made right is within us. And once we are right within, we understand that the idea of that temple needs to go. It's a structure that seems impossible to escape from. But we have to let go of it if we are really ready to do what's right. Jared Diamond, the author of Guns, Germs, and Steel, predicts that the conditions for societal collapse will collide within the next few decades, resulting in what he expects will be a future of significantly lower living standards, chronically higher risks, and the undermining of what we now consider some of our key values. He goes on to suggest that the future is ours to determine, whether we resolve this crisis in pleasant ways of our own choice or in unpleasant ways, not of our choice. As a white American Protestant living in this time, I and other members of institutions of privilege and power must confront our role in developing the morality of a nation whose legacy includes slavery, colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, economic inequality, and systemic oppression and discrimination. We must also celebrate the prophetic legacy of our faith. In continuing the work of prophetic witness and justice, we must embark on the task of addressing the intersections of these issues of justice with our treatment of the earth and its peoples. We must begin the work of transformation. It isn't just the temple culture long ago that we need to worry about. Christianity has a long history of being co-opted by power structures. As early as Constantine, the violence of the cross directed at Jesus seemed to sanction further aggression. Oddly enough, on Jesus' behalf. After a dream that led Constantine to believe that God approved of his military ambitions, he combined the symbol of the cross with his imperial advances and used the cross to conquer land and people. This dangerous coupling of Christianity with conquest would continue for hundreds of years via churches and governments. And most of our modern minds know that the violence of the Roman Empire and the countless other eruptions of violence supported and instigated by Christian religious institutions were tragic abuses of power that resulted in lives lost and ruined. Today, Christianity's entanglements with our systems is less overt. Now, Max Weber famously connected the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism in his book titled such. He draws from Puritans and early Americans, and he elucidates ways in which our religious worldviews shape our interaction with the world. Indeed, for many, the lines between Christianity and capitalism are blurry. Now, while Weber is somewhat reluctant to definitively ascribe capitalism's success in America to Protestant ideals, after all, society is complex and multi-layered, his study asks those of us living in today's world to flip that table and ask, how might Christianity resist these systems we have built in order to reach a more just future that protects our planet and its people? The American capitalist economy exists in ways which prize individuality over community, in ways that I see at odds with Christianity. The for-profit model of capitalism, which measures success via profit and economic growth, cares little for what it deems external. By considering only the desires of the for-profit business and the individual consumer, communities and the environment are subjected to whatever repercussions result from the transaction. Think about communities near oil refineries and other industrial plants. The the communities that experience high rates of cancers and birth defects. Think about how factories continue to move to poorer and poorer countries in order to keep costs low. In order to maximize profit, companies increasingly outsource labor and supplies in an effort to avoid regulation. Regulations set in place to protect human, animal, and plant communities, like labor standards, environmental protections, and taxation designed to support government systems that take care of our communities. This has repercussions for people around the world, especially as our economies become increasingly global. Companies pollute and use irresponsible quantities of resources because it's most economical to do so. We need a less individualistic faith. American individualism presents a barrier to an ecological, holistic worldview. As long as our primary ways of understanding ourselves are as individuals, not as members of various communities, we will lack a perspective capable of understanding the gravity of our lives. The core of Christianity can no longer be imagined solely as a personal relationship between oneself and whatever version of Jesus is your personal invisible best friend. While there are many good things that can come of this individualistic relationship, such a theological directionality lacks scope and leaves ambiguous our relationships with other bodies, perhaps especially non-human bodies. There is a temptation among white Protestant Americans, although certainly others as well, to buy into the myth of individualism that leads people to think of success as a personal achievement and our jobs and lives as siloed. I worry that this perspective disrespects and disregards the many lives that have helped us along the way, but furthermore fails to see the myriad of possible actions and outcomes before us that exist in those interrelationships we sometimes fail to think about. Part of uncovering these connections is undoing the binaristic paradigms that continue to constitute much of Western thought. I believe that our binaristic Western categories sit squarely in many of our blind spots. Much of our world seems to be divided into, supposedly, disparate categories: male and female, spirit and flesh, revelation and creation, saved and unsaved, white and black, citizen and immigrant, human and non-human, among others. More often than not, one category is decidedly preferable, despite the reality that many biblical and spiritual sources will suggest differently. These places also often sit in our blind spots. While trees, people who look different from us, and dogs may be part of our everyday lives, we may seldom consider what it is like to exist as something else. As Alfred North Whitehead, one of my favorite theologians, suggests, in some measure or other, progress is always a transcendence of what is obvious. Progress requires creative imagination and recognition of our interconnectedness. Progress requires us to ask, is Jesus talking about the temple? What do we need to destroy in our own lives to build up the temple within ourselves? Lent is a perfect time for asking these questions. In Transgendered Theology, Ministry, and Communities of Faith, Justin Tanis highlights how Jesus' ministry and the Jewish tradition ask people to seek new and complex ways of viewing the world and Scripture, to tease out all possible meanings, so we have the richest available knowledge of how God spoke and speaks. Tanis suggests that transgendered ways of being similarly call on all of us to look more deeply and consider the complexities of this world from outside the boxes of binaristic thinking. Not only does this ask us to open ourselves to new ways of being and thinking about gender, but it asks us to consider the ways that we limit our own thinking based on our societally ingrained presuppositions about gender and what it means in our lives in the world.